Hello everyone. Today I would like to share some brief thoughts on Jack Vance's book, The Dying Earth. It is the first book in a quartet of books that he wrote that's called, The Dying Earth. And he started writing this series in the 1950s, which is when this first book was written, and wrote his last book in 1984, I believe. Jack Vance is the favorite author, or considered a favorite author, by many of the greats in science fiction and fantasy, including Dan Simmons, Christopher Paolini, George R.R. Martin, Raymond E. Feist, Terry Pratchett. Had to double check on the back of the book here, and of course the man of the hour that we will be talking about at the end of this video, my boy Gene Wolfe. It seems a little disrespectful to call him my boy, but there we have it. The Dying Earth book especially is famous for also inspiring the magic system and a lot of the world behind the game Dungeons and Dragons. I haven't played D&D, so we won't be talking about that a whole lot today, other than to say this is one of the most influential science fiction and fantasy books, really, of all time. And it's really underread nowadays, and there's some pretty good reasons for that once you dive into it, so let's talk about it. This first book, The Dying Earth, unlike the other books in the series, is my understanding, this first book really is a series of interconnected short stories, 6 to be precise, that tie together to paint a mosaic of this world and of some basic concepts that Jack Vance is trying to convey here in this book. This is obviously set in the Dying Earth genre. I don't know that Jack Vance actually created the genre, but I know he's the most famous one. He sort of codified the genre. And the idea behind the Dying Earth genre, in case you don't know, is that it's so far out into the future that it almost looks like the past. It is so far future in terms of science and technology that that the brand new technology, the cutting edge stuff, is now seen as like ancient, spells and ancient devices that, the beings from before would have used. So it is set so far removed that it seems like people have almost gone back in time rather than forward in time. And these interconnected short stories really are about people striving to find meaning in this world, or power and control. There's a lot of that. A lot of the characters can be very dastardly and cunning in terms of their motivations, or people looking for knowledge and wisdom. All of this at the end of the world's life. And so, in many ways, it's all about people trying to find some meaning to life, or some version of new life at the end of the world's life. So, I can't really give you a plot summary of the entirety of the book because they are these small vignettes for the first one, but to give you just a bit of a hook, the first part of the book is about a wizard named Turgeon. And Turgeon's goal, that we learn in the very first page, is that he is trying to create life from pieces of different creatures, from different body parts, from non-life, essentially. So he's trying to reanimate them and create creatures of his own. And he's struggling with this. He's finding that these beings that he's trying to create aren't lasting, that they're dying very quickly, and so he goes to seek a greater wizard who knows even higher and even more powerful spells than he does, so that he can teach him the ways to create actual life from non-living material. Already you can hear in that there's very Promethean themes in this book. This is very much in conversation with works like Frankenstein. It already sounds like that right off the bat here. On this journey to meet this other wizard, though, Turgeon encounters this woman named Tissace. And Tissace is actually a creation of this greater wizard. And yet when he decanted her, when he created her, he did not fully create Tissace in a perfect image of himself. Instead, her brain, her mind, is warped. She perceives beautiful things as being ugly, and ugly things as being hideous. So we'll leave that story for there, but then to give you an idea of how interconnected the book is, the next story actually, or one of the next stories, continues with Tissace, where she has realized that there's something wrong with how she perceives the world, that her perception of things is skewed, is incorrect, and so she journeys to Earth to try to correct this, to seek for beauty, and to seek for truth, to try to correct her view of reality, to understand what's lacking in the way that she was created. And as you might expect, she does not encounter things to be as utopic as maybe she was hoping once she actually arrives onto Earth. And then as the other short stories continue, some of them are more closely connected, and then some of them are set in a location that maybe you'd only heard a rumor of in the story before, or maybe there's a piece of technology that carries over. So the connections between these stories are rather loose, but they are there. And rather than being one overarching narrative, Jack Vance is trying to make a lot of little points in these stories. Or, in many of them, just trying to tell a compelling story in under 20 or 30 pages. Because these are 6 short stories strung together, this ends up being a rather short book, a rather quick read. This is a bind-up of all 4 books in the Dying Earth Quartet. So as you can see, it's a relatively short series all in all. We talked a little bit at the beginning that this is not widely covered, widely read anymore by just general modern fantasy or science fiction readers. And one of the reasons for that is that this is textbook pulp, in the vein of Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, etc. If you do not like pulp, if you do not like sword and sorcery, you won't like this book. Now, I still think a lot of people should read this book, if for nothing else than to learn some of the history of the genre, to see what are the foundational building blocks that we've built on since then. I started the video not only talking about some of the authors who were greatly inspired by Jack Vance, but actually, I believe George R.R. Martin credits Vance as being his favorite author. So it's good to see just the history of the genre as it's carried on from author to author, and to see what inspired many of our favorite authors today. So even just understanding those threads through the genre and where some of these ideas originated is a really good thing. Vance's writing style is incredibly to the point and brief. Like, brevity is the word to describe it. In one sentence, he will say, a character will say, I want to go to this ancient temple and see what I can discover there. And then literally in the next sentence it will say, and so he traveled there. And when he arrived, and this is going to come off as very jarring for many modern readers. If you are used to reading, say, George Martin, or Brandon Sanderson, or Patrick Rothfuss, if you're used to reading the way modern fantasy is presented, and you go into the Dying Earth, this first Dying Earth book, with those expectations, then you're going to have a really hard time connecting to anything, or even really making coherence of some of the plots, because the way he writes it is so different from how we're used to traditional modern science fiction and fantasy being presented. In many ways, this first Dying Earth book takes a lot from fairy tales. In fact, it felt very much like science fiction adjacent fairy tales. I mean, these are stories about wizards and adventurers and rogues, and there's devils and witches and priests and spells and quests and all of this type of stuff. The bread and butter of the fairy tale is in here, like making a deal with a devilish type character, going on a quest to reclaim, some magical item to bring it back to the witch in the forest so that she can give you, back your true name or your true face or something like that. So there's a lot of those types of things threaded through these stories. And so in that sense, not only is this a foundational building block between science fiction and fantasy, but it also has some ties going back to the older fairy tale tradition as well. So once again, if you go into this expecting modern fantasy style story, you're going to be disappointed pretty quickly. So if you're reading this book, then the question is, what do you do? And the answer is, you actually have to read this differently than say you would read another book. And let me explain that. So say all you had read in your life was Dr. Seuss books, and then one day you pick up a Boxcar Children novel. So barely a step above that in terms of the writing, right? I jest here. But if you read the Boxcar Children novel and you say, well, this is lame, none of the people speak in rhyme, and there's barely any pictures, 1 out of 5 stars. You've actually misread the book. You've gone in with the wrong expectations. You've gone in and you've read it with an improper interpretation of the text, and so you've missed completely the point of what the story is trying to do. So this isn't to say you need to have completely different expectations for every book, but when different books are doing different things, if you read them with the wrong expectations, you can actually misread a text. If you pick up a Shakespeare play and you look at it and you say, well, this isn't realistic to how people talk, 0 out of 5 stars. You've actually missed the point of what the play is doing. because you haven't read it through the interpretive lens of understanding that it is a historical piece, that, it was set in a certain place and time, centuries ago. In a similar way, if you read fairy tales and you read about, say, Snow White, and you go, wait, but what type of tax system did Snow White have? I mean, this is a criticism George Martin has for another famous fantasy series, and I think it's rather a silly one, because I think you have to misread the series to get that out of it. If you're reading Snow White and you're wondering about the tax system, or is she at war with other nations surrounding her, then you're actually not getting the point of what that fairy tale is trying to convey. You're actually not getting the right story from the fairy tale. In a similar way, if you go into the Dying Earth and you're like, all right, I want to understand about every one of these little villages, and I want to know about the backstory of all of these characters, and you're going to be misreading it. The way that you interpret and that you connect with characters in short stories is very different to how you read characters in a long-form novel. So in a similar way, if you go into the Dying Earth with the expectations of a long-form epic fantasy or ideas-driven science fiction novel, and not a series of short story vignettes set in a Dying Earth setting that's more about exploring style and it's more about exploring the setting than it is, say, some weird out there idea, then you're probably not going to enjoy this like you could have if you had gone in reading it properly. So that's why I say, this book is not going to work for everybody. In fact, I would say most people who read this probably won't give it 5 stars. I know some people still love these books, but for most modern readers, this probably isn't going to be their cup of tea. But it's a very short read. On audiobook, it's like 6 hours long. In terms of the page count, in my volume, it's like 120 pages. This will take you an afternoon to get through. And it's worth knowing some of the history of the genre. Speaking of which, this book is the primary inspiration for Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. And if you know me, you know that The Book of the New Sun is my favorite science fiction series of all time. In fact, I think it is the greatest of all time. I think it is the best science fiction series out there. And in Gene Wolfe's essay called The Feast of St. Catherine, Wolfe called not the entire series. He was talking about this first volume. He called this the finest book in the world that he had read. Which, wow, that's high praise. Like, one of the greats of science fiction called this the finest book in the world. And he described that you get to a certain stage when you're a reader where you get a book that you're just obsessed with. This is amazing, and nobody else seems to get it. But for you, this is the book. And he said this first book, this very short series of vignette connected, interlinking short stories, was the book to him when he read it. And in this essay, The Feast of St. Catherine, Wolfe said that he hoped that his own series, The Book of the New Sun, would be that for just 1 or 2 people who read it. Well, it certainly is that for me. Wolfe takes a lot from Vance, and you can tell even from just this first novel of Vance's in the Dying Earth series that Wolfe borrows a lot from this. Not just the setting, because Book of the New Sun is also a Dying Earth series, but some of the characters and themes, the quest for greater knowledge and power, and even the feel of the book and the atmosphere can feel similar at times. There are definitely parts of Book of the New Sun that feel like they're hearkening back to old myths and fairy tales in terms of, going forward, we've actually gone back in time to that older style of storytelling. But there are also some characters that are eerily similar. That wizard that we talked about at the beginning of this review, Turgeon, is eerily similar in some ways to a certain dynamic duo that Severian comes across in books 2 and 3, I believe, of Book of the New Sun. So I personally think that the Book of the New Sun is supremely better than this first book, The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. I plan on reading more of these, but I'm really glad I read this one, because this showed me the foundation that Wolfe built upon. This is not required reading in terms of you need to read this to read book, but it does help give some context for the legacy that Gene Wolfe was building upon. So personally, I really did appreciate that quite a bit. I think Wolfe's work is more mature. I think it's more interesting. I think it has a lot more depth to it. But this was still a fascinating read. In my Goodreads review, I said this is one of the best 3-star books you'll ever read. And it is a fantastic book, and there's a lot to enjoy here, but I think you need to have the right expectations. Be expecting pulp. Be expecting this weird blend between science fiction and fantasy. When they talk about spells or different wands that they have or things like that, it's like, wait, are they talking about weird technology, because sometimes they're talking about dials and switches and things that are clearly tech terms. So that blend between the two is, I think, Vance making a statement about these arbitrary distinctions of genre that we create, and that maybe those distinctions aren't as clear as we would like to think. So even though this first book, The Dying Earth, is often listed as a science fiction novel, and there's a lot of sci-fi things that are on the outskirts of the story, it definitely reads more like a sword and sorcery fantasy. Like I said, for me, this is not going to be on my best of the year, but I'm glad that I read it, and I definitely want to read more of Jack Vance, especially since he was such a great influence to George Martin and Gene Wolfe. So guys, I recommend you try Jack Vance. It's a short read, it's a very brief read, and it's a flavor of something different that maybe you haven't experienced if all you've read is modern epic fantasy. So if you've read Jack Vance, let me know what you think. If there are other inspirations of Wolfe that you would like me to cover here, please let me know. And if I run out of any other things to say here at the end, then comment that below as well, because I think I ran out. Anyway, guys, that's all for me for today. Thank you for watching. Take care.
Huzzah, magic powers!